In between Napoleon's famous victories on the continent and his final defeat at Waterloo, the emperor was the ruler of a small island in the Mediterranean called Elba. For a little under a year he would rule this island as his own personal kingdom, guarded by the most loyal of his old soldiers and bitterly resenting his exile at the hands of the Allied powers. This is the story of the Principality of Elba. Napoleon had declared himself Emperor of France after taking power in the French Revolution. As you probably know, Napoleon then made a good go of conquering Europe. The French ruled an empire that at times reached from Spain to Moscow, all due to Napoleon's leadership. However, following a disastrous invasion of Russia, Napoleon was defeated by a coalition of European states in 1814. The Europeans were then faced with a difficult situation. What was to be done with the man who had laid waste to Europe for over a decade? He obviously couldn't be allowed to remain in France, as his popularity made him a danger to the other European states. They also didn't want to make the execution of a defeated enemy the standard. The answer that was eventually agreed upon was exile. The Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed on the 11th of April between Napoleon and the occupying powers, and made both demands and concessions to Napoleon. Napoleon renounced all claim over France and Italy, but was allowed to retain the title of emperor, and was given the island of Elba to rule over. This small bit of land in the Mediterranean Sea, with 12,000 people on it, was to be an independent principality possessed by him in complete sovereignty and as personal property. To ensure the island was prosperous, the treaty stipulated that France was to provide 2 million francs a year to Elba. Napoleon was initially reluctant to make Elba his new home, it being small and far from everything he considered important. He initially wanted Corsica or Sicily, but these were far too important to give to Napoleon just to get him to shut up. Elba was just about the best place that could be agreed upon by the Allies and Napoleon. Tsar Alexander of Russia was reportedly fond of Elba for the reason that it put Napoleon close enough to Austrian interests to threaten them. One observer at the time noted that Napoleon on Elba was as much a threat to Europe as Vesuvius to Naples. It wasn't a bad deal for him overall, and would have allowed for a very comfortable retirement had he wanted one. Some background on Elba. It's a small island located between the Italian mainland and Corsica that from ancient times was famous for its iron mines. Through the centuries it passed through the hands of various European empires and Italian city-states, before eventually becoming a haven for escaped French refugees fleeing the Revolution. It was briefly occupied by the British before finally ending up in the hands of France in 1802. It's a small island with around 12,000 people at the time, with small towns, farms and fishing, and its only significant industry being mining. This was to be Napoleon's new home. On the 8th of May 1814, Napoleon arrived in Elba's capital and declared that, "I want to live from now on like a justice of the peace." He brought his mother and sister with him, and by most accounts they lived an enjoyable life, albeit far from the grandeur of ruling France. However, if the Europeans had expected Elba to be a simple consolation prize for the man that had conquered them, Napoleon certainly didn't treat it that way. He pursued governing the island with extraordinary energy, treating it as more than just an irrelevant blip on the map, but a genuine state in its own right. Whether you view this as Napoleon making the best of things or a sign of delusional narcissism is up to you. The first thing Napoleon did was dictate a new constitution to General Bertrand. The document divided the island's government into 5 departments: that of civil administration, the communes, the emperor's domains, which included the palaces, mines, fisheries, and the entire island of Pianosa, the emperor's household, and the army. 4 of these departments were given to generals that had accompanied the emperor. He then established a sovereign council, made up of 4 generals that had come with him and local Albans. This was theoretically the government of the island, but Napoleon's letters and writings show that he basically ignored the existence of the organization that he himself had established, and mostly just did everything himself. Major I.H. Vivian, a British visitor to the island during the time, commented that Bonaparte held the island in full sovereignty, having his army, his name, his treasury. He imposed taxes. In short, no monarch could be more absolute. And he wanted to act like it. As for the actual governing he did of Elba, it was a mix of highly practical changes and attempts to recapture France on a smaller scale. He established the island's first theatre in a church and created an official group of actors from among the military to perform for him. The military band was used as the orchestra. Napoleon's valet Marchand wrote that the palace on Elba was like the Tuileries, but on a smaller scale. Jean Lacroix, a captain in the new Elban Navy, also wrote of the sort of ceremonies Napoleon insisted on maintaining. While attending Holy Mass for the festival of San Cristino, the emperor was given full honors, accompanied by an escort in full-dress uniform. When he reached the church, he was greeted at the door and accompanied into the building under a canopy. On the emperor's departure from the church, troops presented arms, a tattoo was beaten, the band played, the church bells rang, and cannons were fired. At a ball held in the new imperial palace, the emperor wore a full military uniform. and when he entered the room, everyone rose and stood in silence. He was then led to the throne, where he sat during the ball. So he certainly spent a lot of time making himself feel like he was still the emperor he was on the mainland. But he also made genuine attempts to improve the island, and managed the government with a sharp eye for detail. In his short 10 months on Elba, he rebuilt the sewage system of the capital because the smell had bothered him. He built roads and bridges across the island to ease transport. He set up Elba's first corps of firemen to prevent any large fires in the towns. He distributed corn to the population to ease hunger, and apparently even tried to set up workshops to teach sculpting and drawing to the local people. Napoleon was certainly intent on making the island his, but in his pursuit of this goal, he didn't give any thought to how it would be paid for in the long term. Vast sums of money were spent on maintaining the imperial palaces and the military, which was to be paid by the 2 million francs owed to him by France. France, however, was broke, and in spite of their agreement couldn't afford to waste money on maintaining the monarch of a now foreign country. In order to fund his government, he resorted to increased taxation, which only caused resentment. In the town of Capo-Laveri, a mob was organized by 2 local priests that threw out the army and the police, and a force of more than 200 soldiers had to be dispatched to the town to restore order. The priests were captured and given a death sentence before their sentence was commuted. Some of the locals apparently even sought out an agent of the British government on the island to ask for protection against the exactions of their sovereign. Despite the increased taxation and the military crackdown, within a year of arriving, the Principality was facing bankruptcy. Napoleon would have to either do something drastic or downsize his army and imperial court. He eventually chose to do something drastic. Unsurprisingly, given his previous interests, Napoleon spent a vast portion of his time and the island's wealth on maintaining a military. This was comprised of both an army and a navy. Despite the tiny size of Elba, the army set up under Napoleon comprised of a staff headquarters, a battalion of grenadiers, a free battalion of almost 300 men, a military band, and a group of local militia. The almost 600 soldiers of the Old Guard that had accompanied Napoleon from France included both infantry and cavalry. Napoleon also insisted on a navy being established, because all countries needed a navy. The 2-masted brig Inconstant, with its 66-man crew, became the flagship of the Elban flotilla. This ship was accompanied by 2 smaller sailboats, and this was the entirety of the Elban navy. Napoleon insisted on it being given proper respect as the naval force of the emperor. It would be on the Inconstant that Napoleon would make his escape from Elba and return to France. The combined armed forces by 1815 on Elba numbered about 1,000 men, guarding a total population of 12,000. The payments for this force took more than half the treasury. Napoleon returned to France less than a year after being exiled, on the 26th of February, leaving his principality in the hands of a governor. Though Napoleon was able to briefly retake the French throne, he was defeated by a joined British and Prussian force at the Battle of Waterloo. After this, Napoleon was exiled again to the distant island of St. Helena in the Atlantic, and Elba was given to Tuscany, dissolving the principality. The common image of Napoleon is a man that refused to be anything other than great, and risked everything for a final chance at being the French emperor. But I think having the context of Elba changes this somewhat. The refusal of France to pay for Elba's upkeep left the island on the brink of ruin, and Napoleon was met with the choice: risk it all on a return to France, or slowly disappear in a decaying court and surrounded by deserting soldiers. In this sense, he chose to gamble because to stay wouldn't even guarantee a prosperous kingdom, only a slow decline. The Principality of Elba has perhaps the weakest legacy of any country I've spoken about. Even the Empire of Vietnam eventually allowed Ho Chi Minh to take power. Elba's really only relevant as a footnote, usually a line in Napoleon's biography. He was exiled to Elba from France, but returned less than a year later. Napoleon himself was reluctant to even take it, having first argued for Sicily or Corsica to be given to him. Even so, let's not ignore the fact that for a year, more than 12,000 people were ruled over by a man who was determined to turn the little island into a paradise worthy of the man who conquered Europe. And that's the story of the Principality of Elba.